I think so. That'd be great. Thanks. Perfect, thanks.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I was not seeing it. No, I missed. Thank you.
Perfect. All right, shall we get started? Perfect. So thanks everyone for joining today. This is actually the final session of this season of the COMARL virtual seminar series. But please do keep an eye out on Twitter and our website for details about what our plans are for the next season. More details to be announced soon. Just before we start the talk, a few notes on practicalities. So the talk will roughly be on the order of 45 to 50 minutes with time at the end for questions, but we can be pretty flexible. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat on the right side of the Google Meet here. So you can see a little icon on the top right. You can ask questions there. The session is going to be both streamed and recorded. So if you do not want to be recorded, please take this moment to turn your cameras off. And also please mute yourselves just to minimize background noise during the talk itself. I think that's basically everything. Did I miss anything, guys?
I think that was it. Yeah.
Perfect. So yeah, with that said, it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Francisco Santos. Francisco is Associate Professor at the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at the Instituto Superior Técnico at the University of Lisbon. He is also currently the coordinator of the Group of AI for People and Society at INESC ID. Prior to that, Francisco received his PhD from computer science from ULB in Brussels. His research primarily focuses on applying and developing computational tools to understand collective dynamics and decision-making in social and life sciences. He's been working on a huge number of problems related to evolution of cooperation, human social norms, network science, environmental governance, and so on. And he's won quite a multitude of awards, including the 2017 Young Scientist Award for the Socio-Economic Physics of the German Physical Society, the 2016 CGD University of Lisbon Prize in Computer Science, the Best Blue Sky Paper Award at AAAI 2018, the Best Paper Award at ALA 2016, and many, many more. And to top it all off, he is a really great communicator and teacher, has won Excellence in Teaching Awards at IST Lisbon every year since joining. So that's for the last 9 years straight. So Francisco, we really appreciate you for being here today. Thanks again for giving this talk. And the floor is all yours. Take it away, please.
Thank you so much, Shagan. Thank you so much for the team organizing this series of seminars, for having me today. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to participate. I didn't know that I was the last one closing this series, so I hope I can fulfill the expectations. So today I would like to speak a bit about cooperation. So that's one of the main topics of my research, and I will try to focus on or to address this problem from the point of view of large populations. So this is one of the main topics, as I said, of my research. I try to understand how cooperation can emerge from very simple organisms at the cellular level to human societies, for instance, climate agreements and so forth. So what I would like to do today, I will start I will try to be as much as self-contained as possible. I will try to introduce the framework that I will use, the so-called evolutionary game theory, and trying also to relate sometimes with multi-agent reinforcement learning and how can we jump from one side to the other. And then I will try to speak a bit about the mechanisms that makes us such a cooperative entity. So I'll focus more on cooperation among humans. I will start to speak about one of the topics that I've been working on, which is social norms and indirect reciprocity. And then I will briefly discuss some aspects related with the impact and the role of social networks on the emergence of cooperation. And at the end, I will try to dedicate a bit of my time to speak about perhaps the most important cooperation problem we face, which is naturally climate action and sustainability. And I will finish with some challenges ahead related with the role of technology in all these processes. So the work that I will present, you'll see the names of my collaborators popping up all over the place, mostly Jorge Pacheco, Tom Leonards, Fernando Santos, Vitor Vasconcelos, Flávio Pinheiro, and Elias Domingos will pop up regularly on my slides, as you'll see. So to start to speak about cooperation, the first thing that I should do is to define what I mean by cooperation. What is the atom of cooperation? So the simplest way to define a cooperative act is to consider that I have a donor that is ready to pay a cost to convey a benefit to a receiver. So in this context, we may argue or may ask, why should we cooperate? So if you consider this donation game, the so-called donation game, and if you assume that both donor and receiver play simultaneously in both roles, you get the super famous prisoner's dilemma. So this is a very old question, of course, so it has been posed several times. It has been, for instance, famously described in Darwin's books, arguing that perhaps cooperation is hard to understand through the lens of natural selection. So he was thinking about problems related with social insects and other organisms, simple organisms that create very cooperative entities. But of course, we can find similar examples at all scales and levels of complexity, where in humans you can find several examples, from collective action to hunt and to protect, sharing of resources, or these marvelous collective endeavors like Wikipedia and open source projects. So why do we have cooperation in these settings? So if you have this type of large-scale population dynamics involving cooperation, communication, and all this type of complex processes, we can use game theory to describe this. And you can start using classical game theory, where you have static concepts and rational decisions from the agents, but we can also consider large populations of interacting individuals, where the role is not only to describe what is the most likely outcome, but also what is the dynamics, the ecology of behaviors and strategies that underlie this final outcome. And this is very commonly used within evolutionary biology within the realm of evolutionary game theory. So in evolutionary game theory, instead of having very complex entities, we have very simple agents, but at the same time, the complexity is burdened or is based on the population itself. And we have a dynamical process in it. So the idea is that you have the game, a conflict of interest, a metaphor describing a conflict, and you associate the payoff of the game with fitness. And you basically say that individual with higher fitness will reproduce more. You have a kind of process where you have strategies reproducing the population. But the crucial aspect is that this framework is more general than genetic evolution. You can use and you can show that it's mathematically equivalent to the idea of social learning or cultural evolution. So instead of saying that individuals with higher fitness will produce more, you basically say that the idea of fitness is associated with social success, and the individual with higher returns will be imitated by the rest of the population, and their strategies will spread throughout the population just like a disease. Interestingly, this type of dynamics can be shown to be equivalent in several key limits, very interesting limits and useful limits with multi-agent reinforcement learning. So the idea here is that in one side we have social learning, so I'm learning from others, and the other side we have a population of individuals that learn from individual experience. So successful actions will reinforce and use in the future. So for instance, Carl Tools has several very interesting papers and core papers explaining how we can move from one side to the other. So to give you an example, let's imagine to have a population where I have cooperators and defectors in this very simple setting, where I have a defector that starts exploiting all the cooperators here. His or her choice will be imitated by the rest of the population, and at the end we have kind of the tragedy of the commons where everyone, this doomsday scenario where everyone defects. Of course, you can also think about this example from a individual-based learning perspective, assuming that this defector will get higher payoffs. The blue ones will also try out to be defectors sometimes and reinforce, and the outcome will be the same. This is also a good example how evolution is not an optimizer. So you see, if you look at this from a genetic algorithm point of view, it is kind of puzzling that the fact that you see that evolution is moving the average fitness or the average payoff of the population down. So what are we missing here? So we know that cooperation surrounds us, so what are we missing here? So before getting into the details of the mechanism that can explain the emergence of cooperation, let me make a small parenthesis on the tool, this evolutionary game theory tool. How do we analyze this? So typically you can analyze these using this marvelous differential equation, the so-called replicatory equation, that provides a clue on how strategies evolve in time. So if my strategy has a fitness above average, the number of individuals adopting this strategy will tend to increase. You can also use computer simulations where you, instead of having a deterministic dynamics and a very, or kind of strictly speaking, infinite population, you can have all kind of variants and learning rules and so forth. You can also try to do something in between, which is a kind of, instead of having a deterministic dynamics, you can have a stochastic process. So basically we can assume that, for instance, at each time step, an individual A imitates an individual B with a probability that increases with the fitness difference. So kind of social learning. I will imitate Shagan if Shagan has a fitness much higher than me, so I will tend to imitate him. And I can use different sorts of probabilities to define these. Here I'm using a Fermi function. I can use some sort of exploration rate, and also at the same time. But what happens is that at the end, we get a simple Markov process. So we can see evolution as a Markov process, and essentially you can enumerate, in this case it's very simple, I only have cooperators and defectors. You see that each state of the system is essentially defined by the number of cooperators. And I can move from one cooperator to two cooperators, from two cooperators to three cooperators. Basically, I define a transition matrix, I compute the stationary distribution of this Markov process, and essentially I get what I normally would obtain from simulations. I can, of course, extend this Markov process not to from two strategies to three strategies, and I get into this 2D, two-dimensional simplex. So here you see the arrows is basically the transition, the most likely transitions of evolution, and the gradient is essentially the stationary distribution of each of these states. The problem is that if you continue increasing strategies, you start to have these very large Markov processes that increase dramatically with the population size and the number of strategies. The trick here is basically to find good ways of reducing this Markov chain, and several methods exist. So for instance, one can show that if exploration is small, so if mutation probability is small, basically every time you have a mutation, it is very unlikely that you have a second mutation before the system fixates again in one of the corners. So these corners basically say 100% of A's, 100% of B's, 100% of C's, 100% of D's. And basically what happens is that I can describe the entire system using a small subset of configurations of interest. And the only thing that you need to do is to compute the transition probabilities between this small set of configurations of interest. And you reduce this very large Markov process to a smaller Markov process, basically a network of a very small network, where in this case is a population full of A's, a population full of C's, a population full of D's, and a population full of P's. And you basically use this small transition matrix to describe what we obtain in these very large-scale simulations. Of course, this is basically an approximation. You can use different degrees of approximations using internal fixed points of this simplex. But at the end of the day, what we are actually doing is creating a network of transitions where in the lowest level of approximation, each node is essentially a strategy, a set of actions for each case. So for instance, in this case, I'm showing you an example where you have the traditional business dilemma of cooperators and defectors to a more complex ecology emerging from having actions to cooperate and defect and signals. I signal something before playing, okay? So, and just by adding this small signal, you get this mass of transitions. And this is very much the same thing that, for instance, Shagan and Carl and several other colleagues done recently in very much more complex processes using machine learning and much more complex games. So the idea here is to pick a game and try to ask what is the complexity of the game based on a very simple matrix that allow us to build some sort of relationships of dominance between AI agents. And by looking at this graph, we may analyze not only the complexity of the game, but also infer very interesting aspects related with algorithmic complexity of the game itself. But let me go back to the tragedy of the commons and the main dynamics that we are trying to describe. So with these tools, what can we do? So we can, above all, try to figure out the mechanisms of cooperation or testing hypotheses related with the mechanisms of cooperation using the simplest possible model that is able to grasp it. So using this type of principles, people have been identifying several kind of magic principles that allow cooperation to emerge. So you can, for instance, think about kin selection that has become popularized by the famous Dawkins book, The Selfish Gene. You have multi-level selection, you can have signaling and many others. But today I will try to focus in one particular form or mechanism of cooperation, which is called indirect reciprocity, that perhaps among all of these is the one that is exclusively present among humans. To understand what indirect reciprocity actually means, let me provide you an example of direct reciprocity, which is something that people, most of us are more acquainted with. So the idea of direct reciprocity is that individuals not only have unconditional strategies, but remember what the opponent did to us. So this allows us to design strategies that are conditional on past encounters, on our memory, where tit for tat is a classical example. So I am able to directly reciprocate an action done in the past. In indirect reciprocity, things get slightly more complex, but also more interesting. So imagine that I have just one shot interaction, but my decision to cooperate with someone is based on the reputation of my opponent. And the reputations are basically assigned by a third party that is observing this action. So this mechanism relies not only on reputations, but also on some sort of social control, but also a moral system that defines what is a good and a bad action. To be a bit more precise, let's imagine that I have a player A and player B interacting. I have these observers here that spread their information through gossip to the rest of the population. And later on, if A, for instance, cooperated and received a good reputation, this would increase the chances that A receives cooperation in the future. In this context, it's not really only the idea that reputations increase cooperation. This has been shown experimentally several times, but also it allows us to speak about the evolution of moral systems. Let me give you an example. Let's imagine that A has to decide to cooperate or not with B, and let's imagine that B has a bad reputation. Should A receive a good or a bad reputation? So it's not really clear how we should assign a new reputation. So essentially, we are using some sort of moral system to assess each other action. So what I'm going to do is to evaluate several moral systems or several social norms that are capable or not of promoting cooperation. So I will rely on in a beautiful toolkit proposed a few years ago by Isashi Otsuki and Iwaza, where I can formalize this idea of social norm using a binary system. So it's very simple. I define a black and a white world. Let's say that I cooperate, or I may cooperate or defect, and by cooperating, I may receive a good or a bad reputation. And if I defect, I can receive a good or a bad reputation. In this setting, only one social norm makes sense. So if I cooperate with someone, I receive a good reputation, otherwise I receive a bad reputation. So this is the simplest possible social norm one can think, but if you think closely, you'll see that this social norm doesn't work very well. Why? Imagine that I do a mistake, I try to cooperate and I fail. I'm assigned a bad reputation. If I have a bad reputation, everyone will look at me as a bad person and start to defect with me. And if people defect with me, I will get the bad reputation. So everyone will get the bad reputation and defection will be widespread. So we need to increase the complexity. So we need to allow defection to be justified. So we go to higher order norms. Instead of considering only the action of an individual, I can also consider the reputation of the receiver. These allow me to define a more complex social norm that in this case is defined by 4 bits. So I have to the power of 4 norms. I can continue to increase the complexity here and go to the so-called third order norms if I also include the reputation of the donor itself. Okay, not only the recipient, the reputation of the recipient, but the current reputation of the donor may also influence the outcome of the social norm. Similarly, I can continue to increase even further to introduce the past reputation of the receiver or the past reputation of the donor. This is so-called fourth order norms. So I'm already in 2 to the power 16 possible norms. So even using a very simple setting of binary or a black and white world where reputation can be only good or bad, I already have this huge complexity of the game. So in this context, I may argue or I may ask, who should be considered good for cooperation to emerge? So what are the social norms or the pattern of social norms that can foster cooperation? And secondly, how simple a social norm can be while still promoting cooperation? So these are the 2 things that I would like to answer. To do so, let's imagine a model, a very simple model, where agents can have one strategy that relies on the same type of information that the norm use. So basically the reputation of the donor, the reputation of the receiver, and the past reputation of the receiver. And basically for each combination, I will have an action, and this will lead us to 256 strategies. So it's a huge and complex ecology of strategies. So
hey, Francisco, sorry to interrupt. I think Franz has a quick question.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, just a short clarification, because when you said, well, this most simple norm is very small, but it doesn't work because what if I make a defection somehow by mistake, right? So I think you're trying to be somehow robust against some amounts of mistakes that are possible, but it's not completely clear to me what that desired robustness entails. So exactly what kind of things do you want to be robust against?
So I'm assuming that, that's a good point. So errors here is a key parameter in the sense that not only I can make an action that I can make a mistake when performing an action, but I can also make a mistake when evaluating others. So here, by robustness, I mean a high level of cooperation. So if I can maintain a very high level of cooperation, even in the presence of this sort of errors, this is kind of robust. Does it answer your question?
Well, yeah. So I guess whether you'll be able to maintain cooperation would depend on, well, how often these errors occur in some way, right? Because, well, the simplest possible protocol is fine as long as there's 0 errors, I suppose, right?
Sure. So everything that I will speak is in the presence of errors, in a high level of errors. And that's a very important thing, of course. So, for instance, the first order norms is something that is not so robust to errors. But as we will see, there is a family of norms, or one norm in particular, that is very robust to errors, because it's very rapid to correct an error that happened in the previous round somehow, in the previous generation.
Okay, but so the general idea is to have norms that are robust against, a high error rate without completely formalizing what that rate is.
Exactly.
Good, I got it. Thanks.
No problem. Thank you.
I think Dongi also has his hand raised. Dongi, is
Please
it a short question you want to ask? Maybe not then. Maybe it's a mistake. Okay, nope. Sorry, Francisco.
No problem. So we have this thank you for the questions. Please interrupt me whenever you feel like. So we have this large set of strategies. Basically, this set of strategies define when an individual cooperates or defect based on this strategy or action rule. And this action will lead to a new reputation, and strategies that do well, or action rules that do well, spread in the population using the set of methodologies that I explained before. So we have a model such that I have a fixed social norm. Different norms lead to different distribution of reputations. Reputations influence the success and frequency of strategies that lead in turn to different levels of cooperation. And so what we need to do is to make a link between this huge space of norms with different levels of cooperation. So if you analyze this, you see that out of these 65,000 norms, only a very small subset is able to foster cooperation above 90% of the actions. So it's really, really small. And in fact, these 0.2% of norms, basically, most of them are symmetric. So in fact, you have even half of these are the basic principles. So among those, you see several examples. So for instance, here I'm showing you an ugly table. So basically, this is a binary table for norm 1 and norm 2. I will translate this to English in such that you could analyze the difference. So in norm 1, it tells that I am good if I cooperate with someone who has been good for several times, or I'm already good and cooperate with someone who is good, or I'm bad and defect against someone, blah, 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 blah. Very, very long social norm. And in the norm 2, in the second case, I'm good if I cooperate with someone who is good or defect with someone who is bad. Clearly, there is a difference in complexity. So I used the word complexity a few slides ago, but I was not really defining what I mean with complexity. And here you can see that there is a clear difference in complexity, but we need to find a good way to define it or to formalize this idea of complexity. So one way of doing so is to use the very interesting result proposed by Feldman in a Nature paper in 2000, where he shows through very different experiments that the difficulty in learning a logical concept is directly proportional to the length of the logical expression that defines this concept. So for instance, I could pick this social norm, compute the minimum logical expression, count the number of literals, and get a level of complexity. And clearly this one will be easier to understand and to adopt than the left one here on the left, than the first one.
Francisco, we have a question from Mayank. Would you like to ask the question, Mayank?
Yep.
Yeah,
In
please.
the so I was thinking more in terms of causal and analysis, and how does that help with respect to the higher order strategies and the complexities.
Can you
Yeah.
repeat I missed the beginning of your sentence.
Yeah, with respect to the stochastic settings, how does the causal analysis of these higher order strategies help? And maybe those complexity issues, since they are related in an hierarchical fashion. So I was thinking they might have a positive effect on the training and the inference convergence.
It might, but please note that here our agents are super simple, so they don't do more than what is defined on their action rule table. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
No problem, no problem. But maybe I missed your question. I can return to it if you feel like.
Yep, we can talk
Yeah.
about it in the end. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So what I can do now is to organize and see what is the relation between the cooperation level that I obtain and the complexity index that I have here on the x-axis. And for each complexity level, I plot the higher level of cooperation that they obtain. And what we see is that complexity actually fosters cooperation, but just until a certain point. After that, you don't get much from complexity. And in fact, there is a single norm that is basically to maximize cooperation, minimizing the level of complexity and also the order, which is basically the amount of information that you use. And this norm is very, very stern, let's say, very, very strict. Is a norm that tells you that you should help the good and you refuse help to the bad, and otherwise you'll be punished. This is a kind of very strict and horrible norm that basically that if you look closely, it may look kind of bad, but it's interesting to see that this norm has been found in actual experiments with toddlers, where these experiments with toddlers, they are really, really marvelous. You can check the videos in the web. So basically you have a simple play with puppets throwing the ball to each other, of course, and then the toddler is asked to pick her or his preferred puppet to take home. And often the toddler will pick puppets that help others, which is perfectly expectable, but also puppets that defect against those that defected before. So and this is essentially the fingerprint of the social norm that we call stern judging that we observe in this model. And this is, I believe, an interesting concept. So as you see, a single norm is able to maximize cooperation while minimizing cognitive complexity with a fingerprint that basically even toddlers know how to use it. And you can also see that we can foster cooperation with a very simple moral judgment that if you look closely, you see that it neglects completely the information about the past. So what the donor did or the reputation that it had in the past is completely forgotten. Something that has been also found in contexts very similar to this one, this reputation-based context, as the one as, for instance, in electronic commerce, like eBay, where people have shown that if you report or you have a detailed account from past reputations, does not influence much the chances of or the behavior of buyers and sellers. And Of course, you can use indirect reciprocity to analyze very complex features like morality, punishment, forgiveness. They're all imprinted in this kind of social norm. Of course, you can add complexity on this. So for instance, I'm showing you a recent experiment with humans, where we join emotions to this process. And what we have shown is that emotions are used as if we would have an additional layer in this type of social norms. So for instance, emotions are used to forgive those that defect, but also to punish those that cooperate. So even if I behave badly, if I show the right emotions, people continue to attribute a positive reputation. And this is an interesting concept, and it shows that there are additional layers to this setting that should be analyzed. And of course, if you look at emotions as signals, and when these signals start to be strategic, we can also analyze how these signals can influence cooperation, and it has a very strong impact. And when these signals are associated with some sort of punishment, you can start to think about commitments and other types of dynamics. But of course, if you think about the Achilles heel or the missing points of this type of mechanism, the most important things are, of course, related with bookkeeping. So let's imagine that you have a small society. You basically can imagine that you may record and remember all the reputations, actions, signals, and so forth. But if you consider large-scale populations like the ones that we live in, it's pretty hard to consider that everyone can memorize all this type of information and reason on top of that. So the missing point here is that we are not interacting with everyone else. So we are based on complex networks of exchange and cooperation. And recently, or in the last 20 years, we learned quite a bit about it and discovered that these networks are actually strongly heterogeneous in terms of degree. The degree is the number of links of a node. We have hubs, so we have these so-called power law degree distributions and so forth. And in this context, can we say something about the influence of these networks? And the truth is, networks matter and matter a lot. So for instance, it has been shown experimentally that kindness spreads, again, just like a disease, just like in evolutionary game theory. So for instance, the chances that I contribute to charity increases if I have a friend that also cooperates, increases if I have a friend of a friend that cooperates, a friend of a friend of a friend that cooperates, and when it reaches to distance larger than 3, this correlation stops to exist. So this is the famous experiments and works by Fowler and Christakis that, of course, we can model through multi-agent systems, and it's not really hard to see the emergence of this type of properties using evolutionary game theory, not so much with reinforcement learning, but with evolutionary game theory, it's quite straightforward to have the emergence of this. But we can also try to analyze the impact of having these strongly heterogeneous networks on the spread of cooperation and the emergence of cooperation. And we can see that scale-free networks, these networks with individuals with tons and tons of connections and with others with a few links, are the ones that promotes the most higher levels of cooperation. So it seems that it looks like these type of networks that we observe are the ones that are more likely to promote cooperation. If you look at this from an algorithmic point of view, please note that this is tricky to analyze because in this very large Markov process, we don't only need to record the number of cooperators and defectors if you feel like, but also where these cooperators and defectors are. So we have a very large network, and what we have done is to extract the transition probabilities of this Markov process numerically. And by doing so, we are able to show that essentially the social networks transform the games that we are effectively playing. So imagine in a well-mixed population, so basically everyone interacts with everyone. If you have a prisoner's dilemma, you see that the tragedy of the common, so the fraction of cooperators equal to 0, is the only stable fixed point. But what happens is when you move to other types of networks, in fact, there is a game changing. The dynamics of the game is transformed, even though locally individuals continue to play the same game. And this is the magic of complex networks in transforming the game that individuals are playing. More so if the game is transformed using dynamical networks. So clearly these networks are not static. And if you allow individuals to revise their peers and their partners, you see the network evolving just like the game itself. And if you have so, cooperation emerges completely naturally in almost all games of cooperation. By the way, these type of conclusions have been shown to also, most of these conclusions have been shown to prevail even experimentally, which is something that is also cool. So I've spoke about reciprocity, memory, reputations, moral systems. Are we missing a lot here? And the answer is yes. So the first thing that it's important to take into account is that most of these mechanisms work very well for two-person interactions, but with n-person interactions, tricky. And second, can we understand the origins of cooperation? Can we try to look at problems of cooperation where this cooperation does not exist? So that will be the last part of my talk, will be dedicated to one of these examples of problems of cooperation where cooperation is hardly sustained, where climate action and climate change, or the mitigation of the effects of climate change, is the most obvious example. So when we think about cooperation in this type of context, we normally go and think about public goods games, where, for instance, you have a group of players where, let's imagine that I have 4 players. The blue ones contribute a cost to common good. The red ones do not contribute. There is a collective investment that is then shared by everyone, and the profits are shared by everyone, respectively, if they contributed or not. So this is a classical public good game. However, when you speak about climate action, you still have the problem that you are contributing with the future. So things starts to be slightly more complex. So let me give you an example of an experiment that people have been designed, including us, with humans in the lab, where we try to frame this type of problem. So this experiment has been proposed by Bielinski and other colleagues in 2008, and have been repeated in several occasions in different contexts. So let's imagine that you have a group of players, let's say 6 players that play, say, 10 rounds, where each individual starts with an initial endowment of 40 euros, and in each round they can contribute 0, 2, or 4 euros. So to reduce the chances, or let's say to save the planet metaphorically, we need to reach to 120 euros. So it's not very expensive to solve the problem. So the idea is that if after 10 rounds the sum of the contributions surpass this threshold, then everyone will be happy and go home with the money left on the pocket. Otherwise, if you are below these 120 euros with a given probability, say the risk of disaster, everyone loses whatever they have. So this, basically, the value of R basically defines the collective risk of the problem. That's why the game is often referred to as a collective risk dilemma. So several experiments have analyzed, perhaps the most obvious one is the role of risk. So what people have shown is that when you increase risk, you can see it also as a perception of risk. The percentage of groups succeeding in reaching the threshold increases drastically. So one thing that we can do with this model and experiment, or with this experiment, is try to find out what is the nature of this dilemma, and secondly, can we model the behavioral dynamics observed in these experiments? So the first thing that you notice is that we have not a linear public good game, but a non-linear collective public good game. So the returns are defined by a step function, and returns are also stochastic. So the simplest possible way would be to basically repeat the game and the actions and the possibilities that individuals have. We could also define a minimal collective risk dilemma, where instead of 0, 2, and 4 euros, you basically have cooperators and defectors. Cooperators contribute, defectors do not contribute. And basically what we do have is a group of size n, a threshold m defining the number of contributions that you need to surpass. And these groups are sampled from a large population of individuals. So imagine that I'm running this experiment at the university. Z will be the number of students at the university, N will be the group size from which the groups sampled from this universe of students. And what we can see is that when you run these experiments, people are continuously revising their choices based on what the others did. So the type of dynamics framed using evolutionary game theory may be appropriated here as well. We have repeated these type of things using reinforcement learning as well. I will show you afterwards. I will show you in a minute the outcome. So the first thing that we can see is that the fraction of groups that surpass the threshold increases with the risk value, just like with the experiment. So these are the results of the model. But you can go beyond the model itself or the experiments itself and start trying something that in the experiments people haven't tried. And you could, for instance, analyze the role of the group size. Why is the group size important? So basically the group size defines the scale at which we should aim at solving this problem. Should we, for instance, aim at putting everyone in the world sitting in the same room trying to find an agreement? That's what we are trying to do with climate agreements and climate summits. Or should we aim at something more polycentric with multiple groups trying to find an agreement that all together will build up to a global level of cooperation and contributions? What I'm showing you here is that when you increase group size, the chances of getting into cooperation becomes very, very small. So basically, I'm increasing n in the direction of z, which is the population size. And when n is equal to z, that's what we are currently trying to do in climate summits, the chances of cooperation is very, very low. So basically, this very simple theoretical model is suggesting that we are trying to reach to an agreement where this agreement is harder to get. So if you look at this dynamically, basically what we can show is that if you have large groups or a low perception of risk, so basically this is what we are facing these days, we have a low perception of risk on average, let's say, in the world, and we are trying to find an agreement using large groups. No matter where you start, you always end up in the 0% percentage of cooperation. So we have the tragedy of the commons. The nice thing, or the optimistic side, is that if you try multiple small-scale agreements configuration and increase the perception of risk, then we change the dilemma in something that is much easier to solve. We just need to surpass a threshold, and you can be happy living in the stable coexistence between cooperators and defectors. Naturally, the add-on, the beautiful world of having 100% of cooperators will never be achievable, because if I'm the only country refusing to subscribe green policies, I will be, of course, advantageous. So it's very unlikely to have 100% of cooperation. If you try this out with reinforcement learning or multi-agent reinforcement learning, so we have a population of Q learners, you get exactly the same type of profile. So not exactly the same type of values, but the profile is very much the same. Actually, Q learning and these large-scale populations trying to playing this game can offer very similar results to the ones obtained with evolutionary game theory. It's not really surprising, but it's just an interesting aspect to take into account. And as I would like to show in a second, the results or the information provided by reinforcement learning is complementary in terms of when you compare with evolutionary game theory. Because in evolutionary game theory, typically we define the strategies beforehand, and when you use reinforcement learning, you have the strategies emerging by itself. I will give you an example in a minute if I have the time. So I'll still have some time. Do I?
Yeah, you still have 8 minutes. If you want to leave a bit of time for Q&A, that'd be great as well. But yeah,
Okay.
take your time, Francisco.
Okay, thank you. So this idea that I'm pushing forward here is this polycentric idea, is that instead of aiming at a one global agreement, we'll be better off by aiming at multiple small-scale agreements. And this is, sorry, it went back. This is not really a new idea. If you look at the work by Elinor Ostrom pushed forward precisely the same principle. The fact that we are dealing with a global problem, you don't need to deal with it from a global point of view. You can look at it as a combination of several, if you wish, local dilemmas. And this is an important thing to take into account. So, but can we improve cooperation even further? There are several aspects that have been identified as problems to cooperation here. So I will not have the time to play with it or to explain in more detail all of them. I would like to speak about uncertainty as one of those. So here I'm showing you several examples of problems that have been identified besides the perception of risk. Uncertainty not only on goals, but also on timing, conflicting policies between rich and poor parties, and the fact that we lack an institution that monitor and reward or sanction actions of players. We have been working on all of this, but let me show, I don't have the time to tell you about it, but let me tell you about the role of uncertainty. So uncertainty can appear in goals, can appear in timing. Here I'm showing you the results that we obtained recently on timing. The fact that we don't know how many rounds, if you wish, we have to solve the problem. So if you wish, these 10 rounds of the experiment is basically not clear. So it's there are not many experiments on these, actually. There are no experiments on that. So we devised our own experimental setup. So we have a condition where you don't have uncertainty. You have another condition where you have some uncertainty. So there is a minimum 8 rounds to take, but there is uncertainty when the game will finish. And you have another one where you have an even higher uncertainty. And what we have shown experimentally is that by increasing uncertainty, we reduce the fraction of successful groups. This is not really surprising. However, what we found is that people tend to react in a risk-averse way. So players tend to invest earlier, as we can see, but not all. What we have shown is that uncertainty leads to polarization, in the sense that while in the absence of uncertainty, most players would contribute the fair amount, which means the amount that if everyone would invest that, you will reach the threshold. What happens is that uncertainty leads to a configuration where most or many individuals contribute more than what will be fair, and you increase the number of free riders. So uncertainty leads to very high levels of polarization. And this is very much related also to the fact that you start to have reciprocity. So in the absence of uncertainty, people do not react much to what the others did, but when you have uncertainty, people start to contribute only if the others are contributing as well. And this is interesting because it's a result of several types of strategies. And what we did, we clustered the strategies observed in experiments and showed that basically you have unconditional players, individuals that always invest the same, and we have compensators and the reciprocators. And the nice thing about this is that if you run an evolutionary game theory model for this, we not only reproduce the results that you obtain here, but we show that the introduction of uncertainty modifies the game in the sense that the game is transformed in the kind of rock, paper, scissors game. So we have a flow of dominance relationship that was very hard to perceive from the start. And secondly, it's interesting to see that if you run this is the rock, paper, scissors game that I was showing you. If you run the same thing with reinforcement learning, you basically have a huge diversity of strategies emerging. Yet, if you look at the cluster of these strategies, you see that the strategies that we use in evolutionary game theory emerge naturally from this type of settings. So it is as if the dynamics of the game is nicely translated into evolutionary game theoretical model, and the multi-agent reinforcement learning allow us to explain the emergence of the strategies itself that we use in evolutionary game theoretical model. So I had other things to tell you about rich and poor and wealth inequality, the fact that we have institutions emerging. I had other things related with the fact that these institutions are not stable. But let me finish with some challenges ahead, okay? So I've been telling you about cooperation dynamics, assuming that, of course, I have large population of humans, right? The future and perhaps the present is showing us that we'll soon have hybrid populations comprising humans and machines. And in this context, you may argue what will be the role of these machines in fostering cooperation within these populations. And this is one of the things that we are working now, trying to figure out trying to work on several paths of this so-called that we may call as pro-social computing. So the first thing could be what kind of strategies or properties we should add to artificial agents to foster cooperation among humans. And for instance, what happens if humans, instead of playing these games, start to delegate their choices to the machines? We have shown that just by adding a small subset of hard-coded bots in this population, we can transform these basins of attraction that I showed you before in something that can be much more pro-social. So by including a few hard-coded pro-social agents in the population, I'm showing you an example here from another type of games related with fairness, you can promote fairness in the entire population. The other thing that we have been playing around is with delegation. So for instance, in this climate change dilemma that I showed you before, let's imagine that individuals, instead of playing themselves, they delegate their choices to a machine that plays on their behalf. And they pick somehow the algorithm, they encode the algorithm that the machines will use to play on their behalf. And what we have shown is that by delegating, not only we increase dramatically the level of cooperation and the group success, the number of groups that surpass the threshold, but at the same time, what we are doing here is that individuals, by being asked to encode a bot to play on their behalf, they discount the future in different ways. So the fact that we are playing a game with multiple rounds, they look at the future in different ways and perhaps in a more cooperative way. But of course, let's keep in mind that our goal here is not to create this super pro-social robot. It's important to keep in mind what we are trying to solve here. And thank you again for your time and for waiting until the end. And I'm sorry for missing the time slightly. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thanks so much, Francisco. Really amazing talk. Thanks so much. Everyone's clapping. We do have a few questions in the chat box. If you have time, Francisco, is that okay with you?
Yeah, of course. It will be a pleasure.
Perfect. So Anna, if you're around, would you like to ask your question? Okay. Oh, mic muted. I can ask your question if you'd like. So Anna asks, oh, no worries. The COVID pandemic is showing that cooperation is decreasing at the people level, at the nations level, you name it. It seems that even the high risk setting you mentioned is not enough to lead to emergence of cooperation. What is wrong? Are we dealing with the wrong decision makers, or is it the case that existing models are lacking some parameters? What are your thoughts?
So I think, thank you, Anna, for your question. So you are asking, your question is based on the experimental results, is it? Or on the modeling side?
Let's see, I think her mic is modeling, she says.
The modeling. So most of the results that I showed are based on different levels of risk. So if the perception of risk is high enough, in principle, you could get high levels of cooperation. So, but I'm basically interpolating between the super optimistic side and the more pessimistic side. So we may get high levels of cooperation. So if there is any problem with the decision makers in this context, I'm not sure, I don't know how to answer that. But what the model suggests is that perhaps we could combine this top-down approach of having these global summits with more bottom-up or polycentric approaches to solve the same problem. And that can be something that can be useful. The same applies to the institutional level. We could have institutions that reward or sanction individuals based on their actions. Importantly, as we also show, these institutions should also be designed in the polycentric point of view. Finally, there is a strong impact on wealth inequality. So not all players have the same role and can invest the same. And this is an important feature, as we can have conflicting interests between the rich and the poor, because in practice, they are not playing the same game. In this context, our modeling approaches, our models and suggest that the goal here will be to mix as much as possible rich and poor parties. So if you design agreements where you separate the rich from the poor, the chances of getting to high levels of cooperation will be smaller than if you mix the rich and the poor, in the sense that they need to be influenced. So using this peer influence dynamics, if rich can influence the poor and poor can influence the rich, this may create a positive feedback that may lead to higher levels of cooperation. But of course, these very simple models, and we should be careful with the analysis of it, of course.
Perfect. I think Carl has the follow-up question.
I was endorsing that question. I do have another question as well, but I can wait because I see somebody else is also asking a question. Feel free to do that one first.
Yeah, Lewis, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, so good talk, by the way. It was quite interesting. But so you mentioned later on that you're hoping to combine the kind of reputation, these reputation agents, and have like the social interaction with humans. So that kind of made me question. So if you say had a population set that might not necessarily agree with whether an action should lead to a positive or negative reputation. So you have one set of agents which for whatever reason come to a different conclusion about how how the reputation should be updated. How would that be resolved? Would the population kind of eventually come to a shared conclusion about how the reputation should be updated, or would they just, or is this something that needs to be explored?
Thank you, Luis, for a question. That's a very, very good question. I don't know how to answer. I think what kind of social norms can be implemented in these hybrid systems? It's a very, very good question, and clearly, not everyone could have, of course, the same social norm, and this is another challenge here.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
No problem.
Thanks, Luis. So I think I don't see any other raised hands. So Carl, perhaps if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, great talk, Francisco. I have a couple of questions remaining, but just one quick one because we're running seriously over time, I guess. When you showed the Q-learning experiments, I was just wondering, do you have like a replicated dynamics formulation for this as well, and on a formulation from that, better an analysis from that perspective?
No, so we simply run we simply run a population of Q learners that basically what I can show you the slide.
Because I guess you could do that, right? Given that we know somehow what those dynamics look like, and that would allow you to investigate from a dynamical systems perspective.
I think it's an excellent question. The only issue here is that we use multi-agent reinforcement learning with a behavioral space that is much larger, and so that's why I was using the word complementary, because it allows us what we did instead of having 5 strategies, which was basically 3 unconditional strategies and one which was basically reciprocal, and one which was compensator. So basically, I contribute if the others are not contributing. What happens is that we consider a behavioral space that can have all the combinations based on what happened in the previous round, but also what happened in each round. So the learner can define a policy that is time dependent, but also conditional to what the others have done.
I see the problem.
So from a replicated dynamics point of view, this would mean that I would have a huge amount of coupled equations, and that will be hard. But on the other hand, it's interesting because it complements the other result, because you show that the strategies that we clustered from the experiments with humans and we extracted from humans not only provides the same behavioral dynamics as you observe in the experiments using evolutionary game theory, but you can also show that these strategies are naturally learned if you have a population of learners.
I agree completely with that. I mean, I see the problem. Maybe there's tricks, though, that could be applied, like isolating a strategy, or maybe even going to the discrete dynamics could help here as well. I'm not sure.
Perhaps.
Yeah. Thanks.
No problem. Thank you, Carl.
So looks like there is a comment by Mayank. I don't know if that's a question that you'd like to ask or just a comment that you're pointing to there.
Just a comment here with respect to the alpha star. So I was referring to the games that they have developed, and maybe that can be useful in developing those high-level strategies and those policies that can be modeled. So yeah, that was my 2 cents here.
Yeah, thank you. I do agree.
I see Stephen, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, just a quick question. So have you looked at the emergence of money, sort of using these reputation effects or an exchange economy or something like that, or is there related work on that?
Oh, thank you for the question. I've never looked at it. That's a very interesting question. I would not know where to start, but I think it's a very interesting issue and something to think about for sure. Very nice idea.
Perfect. Any other questions from the audience? Elias?
Hello, Francisco. Obviously, I know a lot of your work.
Hi,
Very nice talk. My question is a bit more about envisioning. When you're talking about all of these norms, your work on social norms, that you see that you can actually find norms that are with low complexity are reproduced in humans. Do you expect that the same type of norms will apply when interacting with artificial agents? Or when humans are interacting with technology? Or do you believe that other types of norms might emerge and they may be more complex?
That's a very good question, Elias. I don't know. I don't know. So I could imagine that similar norms could emerge, but if humans are perfectly aware that the other side there is a bot, then reaction may be different. I'm basing this guess on past works on human-computer interactions and human-computer interaction, analyzing cooperation with artificial agents. But I'm not sure if you can extend this type of reasoning to the level of social norms. So it's not really cooperating or defecting, it's basically assessing what is a good and a bad action. So it's basically a moral system.
And I'm wondering if in this case, there's some kind of transference of reputation. If there is a company backing up the agent, and the reputation of that influences the dynamics is from the company or are from the actions of the agents, or if you can hide behind some kind of a screen.
Absolutely, that's a very good question. It will be interesting to test it. Very nice. Thank you, Elias. Thank you, Elias.
Thank you, Chico. Thank you.
I was not able to explain in detail the work about the work done by Elias at the end. But thank you.
Yeah, actually, on that note, it would be great if we can post the slides online in case people would like to look at some of those works in more detail and so on our website. That would be amazing. I think since we're over time, we'll have to stop there. But yeah, really amazing talk. Lots of great questions. So thanks again, Francisco. Again, let's thank Francisco one more time. And just a thank you also to all the attendees, not just today, but throughout the whole virtual seminar series. We've had a great lineup of speakers, a great final one here by Francisco as well. And please do keep posted again on our Twitter and website for upcoming plans for the next season. So thanks again, everyone, and see you soon.
Many thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great talk.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you.